My name's Pete McBride, and I'm a photographer and also a filmmaker. I worked as a newspaper, actually, as a writer initially, and we covered natural resource issues, and I started photographing some of the stories I was writing about. And the editors were drawn to my photos more than my writing at times. And I was like, wow, this is a lot easier than writing. And 20 years later, I'd say, wow, writing can be a lot easier than taking pictures that are effective. I started doing a lot of photography around adventure sports. I grew up here in Colorado, and skiing and biking and climbing, and so I was drawn to those sports, and I was more interested in photography as a way to go do adventures. So I did nearly a decade ended up doing a lot of adventure photography. From my backyard here in Colorado to big peaks in South America, to Everest, to Antarctica. And after a while I loved it, but I always wanted to tell a story that was had a little more oomph, a little something larger than just another adventure. I started realizing a lot of the stories I was working on had a component of water. Wherever I went, there was people concerned or having a struggle with water. And water it's just that one common resource that we all share. Fresh water is becoming more scarce, more challenging. I came back here to Colorado, and my dad's a pilot, and I was doing some flying with him, and I have another good friend, Bruce Gordon, who works with this group EcoFlight. My father was suggesting that I should think about doing some stories on water, and we have a huge challenge with water in the West here. So I did this project where I followed the river source to sea. Really, it became a personal project. It was a way to figure out what I was going to do next. And I'd been doing a decade of working for publications, mostly National Geographic publications. I wanted to do something bigger. I wanted to do a story that was closer to my heart, I guess, closer to my home, but also that wasn't just a week of my life or 2 weeks of my life. I wanted to really work on it. So I actually spent 2 years, and I followed the Colorado River all the way to the end, and to my amazement, I didn't even know this, which amazes me now, the Colorado River doesn't reach the sea. I just figured rivers go to the sea, right? It's just sort of what you learn. We're so good at engineering with water and diversions that we basically put too many straws in the drink. And so we dried up what many say is the greatest lifeline of the American Southwest. We completely dried it up. They did what's called a pulse flow. They released some water to try to recharge the delta, this estuary that's very important for ecology. And I did a film on this pulse flow. We took paddleboards to the end. We were the last people to paddle the Colorado River to the sea. And I don't say that as like, hooray. I just say that as like, wow, that puts it in perspective. It makes you pause. In doing this, I realized I wanted to do these stories and just make people think, and use photography and filmmaking as a way to make people stop and wonder. My last project is, when I did the Colorado River story, there's a lot of challenges and threats to it, but I figured the Grand Canyon National Park sits in the middle of the Colorado River. It's 277 miles, and I figured that's the shiny pearl that's going to be protected, and that'll be the one, untouched place of the river. And I was down there giving a talk about the river, and a lot of people at the park that work at the park were saying there's a lot of challenges happening with the park. People want to make money off this iconic landscape, the 7th natural wonder of the world. So myself and a writer named Kevin Fedarko, we did a story for National Geographic where we decided, as a way to tell the story of the park, we'd do something a little different. We'd mix adventure with maybe a look at conservation and public lands. So we walked the entire length of the Grand Canyon, which has been done by a handful of people. More people have stood on the moon than have walked through Grand Canyon National Park, because there's no trail. It's really hard to find water. So we spent a year, we actually did it. We walked 750, 800 miles, I'm not really sure, but we basically walked from the border of Mexico to Seattle. So there's so much of this vertical terrain that we calculated that we did the equivalent of climbing 10 Mount Everests. The goal was to use the hike as a backbone to talk about how this very unique landscape that we're lucky to have and share may be changing at a rapid rate. So the idea was that our walk would potentially be the first time we do it, but maybe the last time, because if these changes, there's a lot of development pressures. People want to create larger access, more helicopters, a gondola, a water ski park. If this happens, you could never walk the same park that we walked. It would be a different park. And so everyone always asks me, well, what do you use for cameras? I've been doing this long enough that I've used just about every camera I can get my hands on. I've got a collection of broken cameras all over my house. But I did this project with Sony Alpha series cameras mainly because great quality, and I really like how lightweight they are. So when you're carrying your life on your back, there's no convenience stores in Grand Canyon. There's no cell service. There's no water fountains, there's no electricity, so you're carrying solar panels, your sleeping kit, your food sometimes up to 10 days. You can only carry water for a day, so that becomes a big challenge. Where do you find water for the next day? So I never used to worry about it that much, but I was very, very worried about how much my camera kit weighed. And so to have a camera kit with the solar panels and everything that I could, with 2 lenses, I could get the whole thing down to 12 pounds. I shot the entire film that I'm making on National Geographic magazine story. I shot it on the A7R2, and I used predominantly a 16 to 35 millimeter lens, and I used the f4 because it's lighter. I brought a 70 to 200 just to have some telephoto, and I brought the lightweight version, the f4. So that was it. 2 lenses, 1 body. So when I started, I was like, I was afraid one camera would die. I had backup, so I brought a backup lens. I almost died in the beginning. It was too much weight, too hard, and so I was like, well, I guess I'm gonna have to do maybe the hardest assignment of my life, biggest personal project of my life, with 1 camera body. And I did, and it worked. I dropped it, I got covered in dust. I was amazed, I was impressed. So. But you'd get to these places where you realize you're probably never gonna stand there again in your life. And you just knew it. It took 12 days to get to this one overlook that became a big, pull-out spread in the National Geographic. To the layman, it may look like, well, there's another landscape from the Grand Canyon, but for me, it means a lot because I know that that's a spot that I might have been the only person with a camera that stood there. There may have been a Native American that stood there 800 years ago, but today there's not many people that are getting into these remote areas like that. Everyone told me when I started doing the Colorado River project that it had been done. Everyone's done the Colorado River. The river of the Grand Canyon, there's been 100 rafting stories, there's been a bunch of stories about water, and I said, well, I'm gonna do it differently. So I did it with an aerial approach, and it became a book, and it became 5 short films that won awards, and that was me listening to myself versus listening to the public, and I think that's important. And it doesn't always work. Plenty of times I listen to myself and I completely fall on my face. That's part of the fun too. So there are a lot of people that ask me, how do you become a photographer? How do you work for National Geographic? The key to it is story. And you have to find a story that you care about, and so oftentimes you need to find a story that resonates with you. What I love about photography for me now is it started as a way to get me outside and get me out into the world to do adventures that I love, be it skiing or climbing or biking. But now I think try to use a camera to help highlight those challenges and stories that need attention, particularly for me around freshwater stories and wild places, because there are a lot of stories that aren't being told that should be, in my opinion. That's what I love about photography for me, is it keeps me curious.